Welcome to the Stories with Traction podcast. I'm your host, Matt Zaun. Thank you for joining us as we uncover how stories are one of the most important aspects of your business. We'll talk about struggles, victories, and how you can utilize strategic storytelling to inspire those around you to action. Enjoy this episode. I am so excited for this episode because this episode is going to be a series of 3. We're going to focus on different elements of copywriting. So the reason why I wanted to do these episodes is because I've gotten a lot more questions regarding copywriting when I talk about story strategies. So as I talk about how to craft messages and share one story, there are different elements of copywriting that comes up because both of them complement each other very well. And I've been fascinated with some of the questions that I've received in the last couple of years. So I wanted to have an expert on copywriting come on the podcast and do a deep dive into what copywriting is, why copywriting is important, and you should inspire your team to focus more on copywriting, and how you can implement different strategies regarding copywriting. So today I'm joined by ERIN GEIGER, who is the founder of Muscle Creative, where she teaches people how great copywriting will lead to more business. Welcome to the show, ERIN.
Matt, I am so happy to be here. I've been so excited to record this series with you because it's such an important topic, and we'll unpack it a little later. But especially as we went through a 2-year pandemic, what copywriting is and the value that it brings to companies has really evolved. So I'm super excited to get into it.
Yeah, and I appreciate you mentioning that. And I appreciate you setting the tone for that. And the reason is because I feel like if we would have asked people a decade ago, if we would have asked people 5 years ago, and we would have asked people right before the pandemic, their picture of copywriting might be different than the picture right now. So as you know, copywriting has changed over the years for many different reasons. So I want to make sure that people's picture is clearer regarding copywriting as the way we're going to talk about it. So to kick us off, and then we'll dive into a little bit about your background on how you got to the place that you are now with generating copywriting and content marketing. When I say copywriting, what's the picture that comes to your mind regarding copywriting?
So for me, it's connection, it's relationships. And I think that even that in and of itself has evolved, right? Because I think that when a lot of people hear copywriting, they think sales. They think, well, the goal for copywriting is to sell a product, sell your service, whatever it is. And it is a big part of it. It is the copy that typically surrounds a product or a service to make it enticing for your target audience. However, it is really all about cultivating relationships and sustaining that for the long term, right? And so having a back and forth conversation with your target audience that will then lead to a solid foundation and sales that will last throughout the years as you grow your own business.
All right, so this is really, really important because I'm with you, and I believe a lot of business leaders out there, when they hear copywriting, they think sales focused. They may think case studies, very archaic, very boring text that they're sending out in the world. But what you just said about building relationships, deepening business relationships, and the back and forth, I don't think people think about as much. I feel like too many people view it as I'm speaking at people instead of with people. So can you share with us the difference between what you've seen with different companies, whether it is a small business, whether it's a medium-sized business or a large corporation, where the difference between them speaking at their audience or potential buyers and speaking with them and going back and forth?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's a huge mindset switch, right? And so when you're writing copy, I say, imagine who's on the other end of that. Who's reading what you are writing, right? So I think for for a lot of people, they kind of, like you said, they talk at their audience because let's say they're B2B, right? So they're a business and they're marketing toward another business for their service. And in their head, they're like, well, I'm speaking to that business. No, wrong. Big X. You're not speaking to a business. You're speaking to a person that happens to be employed by that business, right? And so if you kind of look at, imagine who is sitting across the table. Maybe you're having a coffee, that way you can build the conversation that way. And so that's why I say it's kind of like a two-way conversation. And you want it to be, because you want people to engage with the content that you are publishing and putting out there. You don't want it just to be like, what do they used to call it? Spray and pray, kind of like you just get as much copy out there.
Sure.
Pray like heck, somebody, sees it and takes the action that you want them to. None of that anymore. So we want to have this conversation. I always say that we want to link arms with our audience. We're on this journey with them. And I did come up with a term called copy station, which is copy as a conversation. So if you're thinking of it as a back and forth conversation with your audience, it is a big mindset shift rather than just kind of like, oh, I'm going to put out this one thing. Hopefully, something happens with it. And so it's kind of, I think it's a journey for a lot of people, especially those that have kind of been around the business world for a while.
All right. So I want to unpack something that you said that I don't want to be missed. You said, who's on the other end, which really leads us to talking about someone's ideal client. So this is unbelievably important. And I don't dive too heavily into politics on this podcast. So I'm not going to talk about different sides of the aisle, but I do want people to notice the difference with this. And a lot of people that have listened to me in the past know that I was a political speechwriter for numerous years. I've done a lot of political messaging strategy, a lot of debate prep. And what's interesting to me is there are a lot of elected officials out there that over time, they're not engaging with the voters. They're not engaging with their constituents as much as they once did. They all, and again, it doesn't matter what political affiliation it is, they all get themselves in a lot of trouble because they are so detached from their district, or they're so detached from their state because they're doing work in Washington, D.C., that they don't know how to speak to the individuals that they represent any longer. I mention that because this happens all the time with sales reps and marketing teams that don't focus on their ideal client. They are trying to share a message that they feel is interesting or insightful, but they lose sight of their ideal client. And I want people that are listening to this to recognize, because we all know different elected officials that have lost touch with their constituencies over the last 20 years. I mean, there are hundreds of examples that we can point to because they get so caught up in this is what I want to do, and they lose sight of what individuals want them to do for the individuals that they represent. So one of the things that I've done is I've actually created lists of my ideal clients, and I'm constantly focused on what they're putting into the world. So like, as an example, I utilize LinkedIn to do this, and I focus on what quotes are they sharing, what authors are they sharing, what books are they reading, what movies are they interested in. So there's a few movies that have recently come out that CEOs and executives have posted on, talking about the business aspect of those movies. So I'm trying to figure out, what interests them. Do they go and work out at the gym? Okay, so a lot of my prospects are focused on fitness and health and well-being. A lot of my prospects do have children. All of that, it gets me in a position to speak more of the language when I'm doing copywriting. So I appreciate you mentioning that. I know that was a little bit long of an explanation, but I want people to recognize, if you've ever said, for people listening, if you've ever said, wow, that person is out of touch, I want to flip it around and I want to ask you, are you out of touch with your clients, with your prospects? Do you really know them very well as far as how they go about their day-to-day life? So Erin, do you want to expand on that a little bit? Because I feel like so many people have lost sight of that. It's not even funny, and they don't even recognize how much damage they're doing to their business.
Yeah, no, you bring up really, really great points. And I think a lot of assumptions are being made. And you know what they say, when we assume that little, we make an ASS out of you and me, right? And so it's
Sure.
like, I think that there's so many assumptions that go into people think they know who they're trying to reach. They just assume so many things about their audience. But let me tell you, even if you knew your audience back in 2019, they've changed. 100%, I can tell you, like it's different. The way their mindset, the way they think about things, what's important to them, what do they value, what do they expect, what are their expectations, all changed. And so, so all of us have gotten to review, who our audience is, what makes them tick, what's important to them, so much more since going through these past 2 years. So I would recommend to everybody in your audience, everybody listening, go back, and refigure out who it is that you're trying to connect with, because 9 times out of 10, something about them has changed. It would change anyway, in the evolution, of who we are. But with that big global event that we have gone through and are still dealing with the impacts of, things have changed. And you had mentioned, knowing your audience, like they work out, they have kids, that sort of a thing, right? So there's a couple of different ways to look at your ideal customer. You can look at it as one persona, which is kind of the traditional way, right? So you kind of like, okay, it's this person, they're, maybe it's this gender, maybe it's this, they're within this age bracket, they live here, you can kind of break them down that way. But then there's also looking at them as a community, because I think a lot of people will start to struggle with that when they're like, had to boil their audience down to one persona. It gets tricky because you're just like, but my product or service does X, Y, and Z, which can impact, a community as a whole. So some people would just, feel like they were just like up against a wall because they're like, well, I don't know how to explain it down to one person. So for those that are going through that, I say, fair, totally fair point. So what is the community that you are trying to attract? What is that? What are the values of the community? What impact does that community want to make? And that might help you when expanding upon that thought. And then you want to figure out, where does your ideal audience, where do they live, online and offline, right? Like, what are the social media platforms are they on? Or what conferences are they attending, to see what they're saying, what content they are ingesting. You want to see what they're saying, because you want to see what their messaging is, because whatever groups they're in, and you should know that and become part of these groups with them. Then you can see like what they are responding to, and what makes them tick and what they care about. And you can kind of like use that messaging in your own messaging. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you mentioning that. I also really appreciate you mentioning the word change. And I know a lot of times people talk about change, but they don't recognize how rapid change happens. So absolutely, a lot of things changed post-COVID, right? But if you look at the pandemic and what it's done culturally, and I know a lot of people might be sick of hearing that, but we're going to be living with ripple effects changes for quite some time. So it's something that we just need to process better. There's still a lot that we're learning about how things have changed. I also find it fascinating with, it's not year to year change anymore. It goes quicker than that. I actually just had a conversation yesterday with an individual, and we were talking about structuring content from a speaking perspective. And I was telling him, when I go in and I do workshops, different things that I really like to focus on, I said, what's interesting is it didn't change year to year. It changed way quicker than that, like way quicker. So think of, from a culture perspective, just how much changes within a single quarter of a year. So think of January of this year and think of where we are now. Like, there's been a lot of change. Think of where we were April of this year and where we are now, right? So a lot of things have changed. So I want to expand out what you said, Erin, and I would challenge everyone listening to do an audit regarding different changes that have happened culturally. What's happened in society right now that are leading to changes. So there's so many changes that have happened, but one of them was individuals going back into a physical building. So there's a lot of states, a lot of regions that are handling this differently. Obviously, a lot of companies are handling this differently, regardless of where anyone falls on the spectrum of if you're for 100% virtual, or if you're for 100% in person, or if you are for some type of hybrid model, individuals need to know that that's on the forefront of a lot of people's minds as it's happening. So what can you do from a content perspective to connect with your ideal community if that's what they're facing? So I appreciate you mentioning that for sure. So before we go any further and expand any of these points out, I do want to hear a little bit more about how you got to this stage in your life, because you have a very interesting background. So I kind of want to unpack a lot of what you've learned over the years. So you actually started by studying cinema and screenwriting, correct?
Right. Yes.
So how in the world did that happen?
Yeah. So it's interesting, right? So writing has always been a big piece of my heart, right? So even in high school, like I focused on creative writing. And then when I was going into my undergrad, I was like, I just say, I want to tell a story. I just want to help get people's stories out there. And so I graduated with a degree in cinema from San Francisco State University, go Gators.
Nice.
And I majored in cinema, and but I focused on screenwriting because again, there's that aspect of telling that story. And then I did, it's funny because I was in San Francisco, and I'm totally going to date myself here, but it was in the late 90s when the .com boom happened. And so I fell into the online world of, and mostly entertainment, of building these websites. I was always on the content side of it. Right. But because I have a film degree, my husband didn't want me to have any regrets. So we were like, we were either going to move to LA or to New York. And we ended up moving to LA. And I furthered my film experience by being certified in script supervision, which is continuity. So that's like working with the director, and with the editing and everything, making sure that all of the cuts match up and all that good stuff. So again, making sure that the story flows and continues, right? Miss San Francisco terribly. So we were only in LA for like about a year, and then we went back up to the Bay Area, and I worked in online again, always on the editorial or product side, building community, building stories, and mostly in entertainment. And so loved it, because I got to kind of marry my two passions, of building something from scratch and telling a story at the same time. And so when I moved, I'm now in Austin, Texas. I was in the Bay Area for quite a while, through the .com bust, I will say too. I always laugh during the boom. We were like, the money's never going to run out. The money ran out. And so there was a .com bust, right? So, and any of your listeners that were in San Francisco between like 98 and 2002, send me a note, find me, because we have got to talk, because I always love people who went through that, because it's like, we have stories. It's so great. But now in Austin, I was, now more like in the tech zone, right? So helping startups, but more with a tech background rather than entertainment. And so it was quite the journey, but I have found that when I look back in my career, I realized that I never replaced anybody. Like when I was working, first of all, I was always working for a startup. I did work for CNET, who operated as a startup, even though they were a larger corporation. And then we were acquired by CBS, the big television network, right? Which was really cool and exciting, but always a startup mode. And I never replaced anybody. I was always the first one hired to build out the content team, to build out the launch team. And so I was like, that says something, right? So I actually encourage people to do that as well. You learn a lot about yourself. Really look back at your career and notice the trends, of kind of like what makes you tick, right? Because then knowing what helped you grow will help you as you connect with your audience too. But yeah, so I noticed, I was like, gosh, okay, so I love making things harder for myself and building things from scratch, apparently.
Making things harder for yourself. That's awesome.
I love a blue ocean, just like figuring it out. Always being the creator, the original creator of something, and then moving on. So yeah, it's been great. And so I still love working with startups while also working with, solopreneurs and small businesses too. Like that really kind of lights my fire.
I'm fascinated with your love of writing. because obviously it led you to where you are right now. So I have a question for you. So
Yeah.
my son, Elliot, who's 8, we have, as you know, he's gotten older and his siblings have gotten older. We've had to tweak the way we do bedtime. So for all the parents listening,
Yeah.
you know the different bedtime phases, and are they up too late? Are they going to bed too early? Because then they're going to be up too early, and then I'm going to get up too early. So with all the different changes, we did have him reading before bed, right? So we've really driven out this passion in all our children of reading before bedtime. And recently, typically while he's reading, I'm actually writing. So in the evening, that's my writing time. And he came up to me recently and he was watching me write. And he's like, "Oh, why don't you do this? And why don't you do that with the way it's structured?" And he's constantly doing this. He's constantly focusing on copy, not necessarily copywriting, but content. So he's really into different YouTubers and how they structure their content, what gets more subscriptions, what's getting more views. So he was leaning over my shoulder, watching me type out these different things. And what I'm typing is copywriting essentially. And he's starting to get fascinated with that himself. So, what advice would you give to Elliot? Because I'm sure he's going to listen to this. So, what advice would you give to Elliot as an 8-year-old to position him for the next few years as he enters middle school and high school? Where should he be when it comes to that fascination of writing?
First of all, I mean, I love that. I mean, go Elliot. That's really incredible. And isn't it amazing? Because I have 2 kiddos as well, and both of them, one's teenager, one's 10, and both of them make suggestions as well. And they've told me multiple times that I need to have my business on Discord. They're like, "Mom, why aren't you using Discord? Like, you really could connect with your audience there and all this stuff." So it's like, we should all listen to our kids because they know what's going on. But I would suggest for Elliot is to find whatever makes him excited, whatever he's interested in, whether it's let's say it's a certain YouTuber, right? And then watch the video. And then like say, how would you have done that? How would you have written that content? Like, right. So would you have ended that video in the same way, or would you have had the YouTuber do something else? Would you have covered that game, or would you have had them, and if you would have had that, let's say it's a video game, then what do you think, what do they miss? What else could they have mentioned, or how could they have gotten their audience more engaged, right? So kind of like look at something that he loves and put his own spin on it, right? Because I think that's going to be huge as well. And he's getting to know the audience. He's up on the amount of people subscribing and all of that, which is great. So keeping tabs on the audience and where they grow and why, as well as kind of keeping his personal voice into it, I think will take him really far.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. He's inspiring me all the time because he'll say, "Dad, you have this many subscribers and this person over here has this many. Why is this person half your age and they have a bigger following than you?" So that always makes me feel really good about myself and inspires
Yeah.
me. So, all right. So we covered the 8-year-old piece, but a lot of 8-year-olds are not listening to this episode. So if you were to challenge business leaders listening, so individuals that run teams, whether they run a sales team or they run a marketing team, hopefully their marketing team understands the inner workings of copywriting. But if they're running HR or whatever department they're running, what suggestion would you give to them just to notice copywriting in their day-to-day lives more? Because I feel like a lot of times there's different elements that come across our desk that are copywriting that we don't necessarily view as copywriting. And there's different things, just like you had mentioned with Elliot paying attention to X, Y, and Z. What would you recommend a leader doing to be more cognizant of what copywriting is in their day-to-day life?
I would say be aware. Be aware as emails come into your inbox, whether it's through your personal or professional inbox. Let's say what email subject lines, get really specific, right? I'm going to give a very specific exercise for people to do. Okay. Notice the email subject lines that grab your attention. Whether it's in your personal inbox or your professional inbox. Start to get Evernote or whatever, app that you like to use. Start copying and pasting them over into this app. right? So you have like a steady sort of toolbox of all the stuff that has grabbed your attention. You can start out with email subject lines. You can move into social media stuff. And I don't care what it's about. I don't care if it has nothing to do with anything that you're really interested in or what your job is. If it caught your attention, there's a reason for that. And if you start kind of making this sort of toolbox, then you can start noticing trends. Like, why did it catch your attention? What action did it cost you to make? Even if it was just, I read the email, or I've opened the email, I didn't, or I liked the social media post, whatever it is, pay attention to that, because then that's gonna help you, especially if you're leading a marketing organization, or you're, you're, a senior exec at a company who just wants to understand more of that side of the business. That's going to give you, that connection, and it's going to super impress the people on your marketing team, because a lot of people don't know what marketing teams do, or they think it's like all fluff, right? And it's like, it's not. And so you'll be super impressed that, if you go to your marketing team, you're like, oh my gosh, I got this email, the other day, and it was this email subject line, and it really made me think. And I opened it, they're going to be like, dang, like he or she's really paying attention, And so, so that's what I would say is like that. Just, if I could assign you guys homework, is to start really paying attention to the marketing that comes through. Even if you're on the train, right, on your way to work, and you see something that like a poster, or something that you're like catches your attention, jot that into your app too, because you'll be kind of amazed when you start to see the trends of what catches your attention. And then that could help you kind of like frame messaging for your company as well.
All right. So I'm going to challenge everyone listening, and I'm going to be a little bit more forceful with this suggestion. And here's why. Because I know there are people listening right now where they may be thinking to themselves, immediately thinking, oh, that's something that I can delegate.
Right.
So I know there's a lot of CEOs, a lot of VPs of sales that are listening to this that are saying, oh, I have hundreds of people that I work with. I'll just find someone to do that for me. So here's the danger in that. And here's what I want business leaders to really grab a hold of. I often talk about how someone like Steve Jobs utilized storytelling to create one of the most profitable companies in human history. And people recognize Steve Jobs, whether you love him or hate him. He had a lot of negative things, but he had a lot of positive from a business side. So a lot of people recognize him as a branding and marketing genius. He was a master communicator, incredible storyteller to really hook people into the conversation that he wanted to have. Doing this exercise that ERIN recommended will teach you how to get better at different hooks. So what's amazing to me is when I'm going out and I'm doing workshops, or I'm doing keynotes, or I'm doing any kind of training, one of the things that people have shared, or they'll say to me quite often, is, wow, you're really good at hooking your audience. Wow, tell me more. That's a great hook. I feel like I got really good at that by listening to advice from ERIN, because while you're more cognizant of copywriting and what grabs audience's attention when it comes to an email subject line, or you'd even mention a billboard or any kind of copywriting in, let's say, even a LinkedIn social media platform, you're going to get so much better at doing different things to hook your audience that when you're on that Zoom call, on that company call, you're going to be able to hook your listeners' attention even better. What you might be presenting to your leaders, you're going to be able to hook their attention right out of the gate and get into what you want them to know. So I don't want people listening to this to overlook this, thinking, oh, I could have someone else do that. The more you recognize this, the better you're going to be at hooking people and then driving the conversation. So I had to say that, ERIN, because people say that all the time. I'll get someone else to do it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And that defeats the purpose, right? It's like, it's top down, right? And so it's like the senior execs, like, you guys need to know this stuff too. And it'll just make your, entry into the market and your growth in your market that much stronger, because then everybody's in lockstep. Because if it's only the marketing team that knows the messaging of what we're trying to get across, then you're losing the battle. and you might lose the war, right? Like everybody across the company from top to bottom back up needs to know how you're speaking to your audience. And to your point, Matt, it's not only the copy external, but internal as well. And when you're having those meetings with prospective clients and customers, as well as internal kind of all hands meetings with your staff, it goes across all of that. So yes, so I will underline, highlight, put in bold, do this yourself so that, and you'll see exponential impact from that instead of delegating.
Absolutely. So I'm fascinated with how much we covered just under the what portion of this series. I was, while we were getting into this, I'm like, are we going to be able to talk about this for this length of time? And the answer is yes. The answer is people really do need to understand what copywriting is before we move on. So before I wrap this episode up, I got a lot of different takeaways myself. So there's a few things that I'm going to take away from this episode just to recap, and then we'll close out. So I really appreciate what you said, Erin, regarding viewing copywriting as building relationships versus sales focus, really viewing it as back and forth versus speaking at people. I think that was a really, really good point. You asked the question, who's on the other end? So who's really listening or who's watching what you're putting out? And that really goes back to not necessarily an ideal client, but your ideal community. So I appreciate you getting us to think bigger about not just an ideal client, but also who's the broader community that you're speaking to. So I really appreciate that point as well. Then I appreciate the third point that you brought up that I thought was really important, which is what's changed. I know it's a simple question, but if you truly do an audit of what's changed, there could be some complexities to what's changed. And it's not just year to year. It could be quarter to quarter. It could be month to month. Heck, it could be week to week. I mean, there are leaders that are dealing with things from different weeks. So we have to be more mindful of how things change and how that relates back to our ideal community. So I appreciate those three takeaways. I also appreciate the homework that you gave everyone listening, which I thought is really, really good advice, which is do something as simple as see what emails you actually open. So as a business leader, what prompts your action to open an email, and then copy and pasting that into a note to start to see what are the different themes to prompt your action in opening an email. So if that was a hook for you, while you're speaking to your team or your prospects or clients, how are you getting your audience hooked into the story that you're going to share with them? So Erin, I'm amazed at what we covered under the what just in the time that we had. I think you shared a ton of value. That's why I am unbelievably excited for the next episode where we're going to focus on the why. So diving deeper into why this is so unbelievably important from a sales perspective, a marketing perspective, from a company culture perspective. Why is it so important? But before we wrap up, I want to give you an opportunity that if anyone listening wants to learn more about what you do at Muscle Creative, they want maybe to reach out for help from you, where would they go to do that?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I'm on LinkedIn. You can go find me, ERIN Geiger, on LinkedIn. And I'm also on Instagram at Muscle Creative Co. and Facebook as well. And then they can always email me, erin@musclecreative.com. I always love to help people with their copywriting questions. And maybe there's a way we can work together too.
Perfect. I will include that in the show notes. Thank you so much, Erin. I know you're extremely busy, so I very much value your time today. Thank you for sharing insights with us.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Thank you for listening to the Stories with Traction podcast. If you have a story that you would like to share, feel free to drop an email to matt@mattzaun.com with the subject line Stories with Traction. Also, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, where I share tons of resources on how you can be a better storyteller. Remember, if you want to persuade with power and inspire those around you to action, you must share more stories.